Hello developers, welcome to the new Codolex activities video. It's been a while since our last video, and that's because we as GDK Software are also organizing an awesome event, the Delphi Summit 2024 in Amsterdam. You might have seen it already, and if not, be sure to check it out. It's going to be awesome. But for now, Codolex. We are going to take a look at something that I'm sure will be used in almost every Delphi application, database activities. We'll take a look at retrieving and saving data in flows, as well as working with transactions. To show these activities to you, I created a database application following our other video working with databases. If you're not comfortable with creating or connecting a database yet, please go watch that video and come back later to learn more. So as you can see, we have our data module here with the connection code for our local database. And to show you that's working, I will now implement DB grid with the Codolex project and dataset to show you simple data from our database. So now we set up our Codolex project, which is connected to the project we created with a data source. The dataset is connected to the project and has the data and the event. And the data source connects the grid to the dataset to show the data in a form. So let's run the application and see the result. As you can see, I have a few events defined. Now let's see how we can create and modify these events in flows. So let's start with our first activity, get from DB. The editor for this activity is somewhat different than for the other activity screens. You have to start by selecting an entity that you want to retrieve. If I'm going to use this flow to load my data, for example, instead of via the dataset, I can start by selecting event, and then some other options will pop up that look familiar to SQL options. And essentially, it's just that it's creating a SQL query to retrieve a data. So you can see the simplest form is just select everything from event, and that's it. So now the options we have is to limit our result set. One is by implementing a where query. So I could say where our event ID is 1, for example, or by limiting our results. This is useful if you want to get one entity instead of a list. So you can select first, or you want to get a range. You can start with an offset and see how many you want. So let's say I want only the first two events. I start with an offset of 0 and a record count of 2. And when you want to limit the results, an order of your results is mandatory. So I'll say order by event ID. And that's it. Now we can return our result list as the return value for a flow. And in our main form, we can select in our data set a flow instead of an entity. So let's save this and compile this and see what it does. And here you have it, the first two events from our flow. So that's how you can use this activity to design the query to retrieve data from your database. You can always inspect this query in the preview of the flow. To round it out, I will add an extra option in the where. Let's see what the result's going to be. This is how you can design and inspect your queries to get data from the database. Keep in mind though that this activity is limited for advanced queries. The select statement is not editable and uses only the basic get all data from this table query. To design more complex ones, we need to take a look at view entities in our local database. We can add a view entity and let it inherit from an existing entity in our database. So for example, I can use the event as a basis and then change the query in this select statement part. Let's say I want to see the name of the course that this event is related to. I can add the course name to fields, and I need to left join the course on course ID, I think. And we can synchronize fields to see the result. So now we have our name added to the fields of our event. This is a view entity, but because it uses an existing entity as base, we can also check the view entity updates entity option. This allows us to save this event later and update the own fields of the event object. Now we need to give it a name, for example, event view, and then we can save this to our local database. We can use that new entity in our get from DB action to get the updated query. As you can see, the select is now updated with the select statement that we entered in our view event. So let's just remove these other limits for now and set this new list as a return list for our flow. I've updated the dataset and the grid to show the name of the course in the grid next to the event details. Let's run this and see the result. Now let's move on to our new activity, the save object activity. This will save a new entity as a record in a database or made changes to an existing record persistent. So for example, we can use the create variable activity to create a new event entity with a course and an event date to save to the database. We can use this flow directly in our form and call it via the use in code functionality, and afterwards refresh the dataset to see the changes immediately in our project. So let's create a new event. And there it is. If we want to use this activity to update an event instead of creating a new one, we can use the get from DB function again to select the entity we want to update. So for example, if I want to get the event view, where our event ID is 29 is one of the IDs I saw. ID is 29. And I want only the first one to directly update instead of filtering through the list in the flow. I can use the change variable activity here. So let's change our event view and say, well, the event date is going to be a year in the future. Or a year later than the event date was. And now we can save the object that we changed. So let's see if that object gets updated in our grid on the forum. And we can see that the event date for the event with the ID 29 is still 2024. If we click this button again, we see that it gets updated to 2025. And since I'm creating or updating the events, it might be a good idea to implement the delete as well. Otherwise, our database will get flooded with useless events, I think. So let's set a flow called delete event, or maybe delete last event, where we are going to delete the last event present in our database. To do that, we need two activities we talked about today. The first one is the get from DB action. And then we can retrieve our event or event view as well. And if I wanted the last, I can say, all right, I want only the first, and I want to order it in event ID descending order. So now I have my last events view, and then I can do the delete object action with the events view. It's called event view list, but of course that's just one event view. So let's remove that. And I'm going to save this. I'll make it static as well for easier use. And then I'm going to use it in the main form. Set a new button to delete our events. And we can simply use the use in flow action again using code. And after that, I can refresh the dataset as well to see the results immediately in our DB grid. And let's hope for the right result. There we go. Event deleted. A good thing to keep in mind is that the delete object and save object activities only take single entities to delete or to save. So passing a list to this variable is not possible yet. One way to make that possible is to use a loop and then place the activity in a loop. So if we would not limit our results to only the first, but take all events and change the date to the same day, we could add a loop to our flow and change the flow to execute the loop and then change the variable and save the object inside the loop. Make this one a little bit bigger so we can see it better. Now I have to set in the loop that I want to loop over our event view list. I'm just going to call this object event. And I can use this in my change variable instead of list. And in the save object as well. So let's choose a new date, for example, in the past. It's way back. And then execute this flow to see that it updates all events. Here you go. So this is how you can use a loop to save all objects in a list. But the problem that arises with this is that every time you use the save object activity, a query gets executed on the database. You can imagine that that's performance heavy if your list is far greater than the 3 objects we just updated. To make this more efficient, that's where transactions come in. We can use these transactions to make our queries more efficient and update and execute updates or delete in batch instead of one by one. So for example, start a transaction at the beginning of this loop. Let's make some room for the activity. And then commit this transaction at the end of the loop. Let's say we change it again to date 1 year later. And then we commit the transaction on our database. Now we can show you that it works, although in this application the performance difference will be minimal. And now the event dates are updated to 2001 when we execute the flow again. Now what we can do to show the transaction is, instead of a commit, using a rollback. This rollback will roll back the changes that we made. So if we want to change this date again, we can see that it won't get updated this time. Of course, using transactions can have a lot of other use cases. For example, if you use databases with multiple users at the same time, prevent locking or problems of the same kind. So that's it for our video on database activities. Hopefully it provided with some insight on how to retrieve, edit, and delete data from the database. If you got any questions left, please let us know. Hope to see you in the next one.